Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for your patience while we sorted that out. My name is Irene Hongping Shen, and I work with Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. Thanks for joining us today for this panel. This panel was put together by Public Services International, Scottish TUC, and the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. And we want to thank Platform and FOE and STUC, Warren Want, and the Just Transition Centre Scotland for giving us the opportunity during this Just Transition Hub to get to showcase some of what we're going to hear today. As many have talked about already, there's a lot of global inequities that made this particular COP and people's chances of getting to Glasgow very, very difficult, if not impossible. And what we wanted to do with this panel was to create a space for voices that would otherwise be silenced in this process so that people could hear from people around the world stories that are not only relevant but critical to our fight against climate change. I think for many, the stories that will be shared today, struggles on the ground by unions against privatization, particularly in the energy sector, are not considered fights against climate change, but these in fact are working class fights that are really rooted in the heart of the struggle against privatization, against neoliberal policy, and against the heart of capitalism that has us bound up in a dysfunctional, destructive, exploitive, and extractive system right now. And so what we're hoping to have today is hear comrades from around the world really share the stories that have been taking place on the ground against the privatization of energy, the strikes, the struggles, and give a chance to these voices to be heard and to be understood as central to the fight against climate change. So I'm going to hand the mic over to my comrade John Treat, also from TUED, to facilitate the panel. And just one more note, there's going to be interpretation in English, in Spanish, and French today. And all of these things that take time and resources are an effort to really try to redistribute the resources so that voices that are traditionally marginalized actually get to be central in spaces where many people are gathering and where oftentimes people get marginalized. And so thank you for your patience. I think it just reflects the need that resources and time and attention need to be put to these practices like getting interpretation set up that don't usually get given space for. So thank you and the audience for your patience, but also the panelists who have taken their time today and sort of everybody's patience in working through these processes so we can get to hear the stories we really want to hear. So I'll hand this over to John and enjoy the hour.
Apologies, before John takes the floor, could you please increase the volume in the Zoom? The room needs to be louder in the Zoom, thank you.
Just a note to the people speaking in the room. The mic needs to be really close to your mouth so that the interpreters can hear it. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Irene, and welcome everyone again. As Irene mentioned, my name is John Treat. I'm also with Trade Unions for Energy Democracy based in New York, specifically at the School for Labor and Urban Studies, which is part of the City University of New York in New York City. I have some opening remarks. Irene actually made some of the points that I want to, but I want to mention a couple of things, which is that in the opening session this morning, we heard from good friends from War on Want, from the Scottish Trades Union Council, the Fire Brigades Union, Friends of the Earth International, as well as our own TUED coordinator, Sean Sweeney. I won't try to repeat Sean's remarks here. I think the recording of that session will be available. Hopefully, there are some materials on our website as well. But I just want to reiterate that TUED has published a series of lengthy reports as well as many shorter pieces documenting the failure of neoliberal energy policy to produce the speed and scale of change that's necessary to meet the climate challenge. But also the fact that they've not just failed, they're actually standing in the way of the transition that we need in many ways. And they've not led to an energy transition, but actually to an energy expansion. So you have coal, oil, gas expanding alongside renewables, and renewables continuing to fail to displace them from the systems that we're dependent on. But those policies have also caused devastation for working people and communities around the world. Unions are fighting back, however, in Chile, in France, in Mexico, in Puerto Rico, in Scotland, in South Africa, Trinidad and Tobago, and many other places. Unions are seeing through the empty promises of, quote, green jobs. As public energy utilities continue to be privatized, multinational companies continue to impose conditions on the global south through power purchase agreements, other kinds of special protections for private investors and so forth. And all of this under the guise, of course, of climate action and even just transition. And the neoliberal insistence that someone must make money on the transition is continuing to impede progress and making it impossible to plan the transition that we need. But more and more unions are taking up the working class mantle for public ownership and democratic control, to create the conditions for dignified work, health and safety protections, protections for communities, union wages, while also decarbonizing our energy systems, but the wider economy as well, and transitioning the economy fundamentally. So we're going to hear from union representatives from a number of these locations that are actively involved in these fights. We've gone to special lengths to make the tech support this. Please bear with us if there are some complications along the way. We may need to pause and readjust. But I will introduce the panelists one at a time. I think you've each got 7 minutes, if I'm understood correctly. Yep, 6 minutes. I beg your pardon. I just took a minute back from each of you. We'll try to have time for some discussion at the end. We've got quite a number of speakers, though, so I'll shut up and we'll move on. With that, I'll introduce our first speaker. Nela Pineda is with the New York State Nurses Association, fellow New Yorker, and with that, I'll hand over to Nela.
Good afternoon. The New York State Nurses Association represents over 42,000 members across New York State, and I'm here to let you know that we are 100% in support of fossil fuel-free economy. We must be doing everything that we can do to speed that reality along. As nurses in the front lines of patient care, we have seen up close the horrors of COVID-19 pandemic. Over 56,000 people have died in New York, and countless others have been left wounded physically and mentally. We have seen the deep impact that the pandemic has had on low-income communities of color. The disparities are all encompassing, affecting marginalized communities physically, mentally, and economically. We know that this is just a preview of what lay ahead if we do not take climate change seriously. It is critical that we heed the warning. In fact, we already have seen the destruction that climate change and environmental degradation has had on the health of our patients, from hypertension to asthma. Our patient population is getting sicker. No one is going to tell me that climate change is not a public health crisis. Vulnerable communities are also target for environmental racism, and this must stop. Your zip code should not determine your access to clean water, breathable air, and healthy home. Our community should not be a dumping ground so that another one can thrive. I recently came home from a night shift to my basement being completely flooded. I never had to deal with this in the past 28 years I've lived in my home. There was the last thing that I thought would have to face coming home from work all night. I was grateful that my family and friends were all safe, but devastated over the horror stories of those who did not make it. Like our operating rooms have been flooded and the surgeries that day had to be stopped. Who would have thought some afternoon rainstorm coming on the tail end of Hurricane Ida would have turned out to wreak such havoc? The saddest thing is that this is just the beginning. And more I'm reminded to my first real understanding of the effects of climate change when I went to help the people of the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan. I am realizing this is not something that is happening somewhere else anymore. It has come to our doorstep, knocking furiously and asking us, what are we going to do about this? Climate change is a health crisis. Nurses are a critical piece in helping with mitigation, adaptation, and policies around global climate change. So that's the part that nurses are involved with climate change and how we're facing it. And now let me talk to you about the privatized healthcare system in the United States. Under a profit-driven model, cuts will be made to squeeze out the most profits. We see that in the case of nurse-to-patient staffing ratios, safe staffing is and has been the #1 issue for nurses across the United States and the world, and it has only gotten worse. Not being able to have the adequate amount of nurses to sufficiently take care of our patients puts everyone at risk. It is a terrible thing for a nurse to know that they may have been able to save a life if only there were more hands on deck. This for-profit system places people over profits time and time again. It puts our health, livelihood, and reputation at risk on a daily basis. We must ask ourselves, is this the kind of society we want to be? We signed up to be nurses to heal people and made a pledge to do no harm. Understaffing often puts nurses in a position in which they are not able to fulfill this oath. Thankfully, we were able to get safe staffing legislation passed in New York State this past June. The pandemic helped bring to light how much we needed it. We have fought it for 20 years to get something done, and we know we will have to continue to fight to implement the law. We are under no guise that the battle is won. We do have public hospitals in New York City, but what has happened is that these hospitals had been stretched to the brink because they have been forced to pick up all those patients that are refused care at private hospitals. As private hospitals seek patient care that increases revenue like cardiac surgeries, they seek to shutter services such as mental health and labor and delivery. These services are picked up by public hospitals. Unit closures and hospital closures have pushed a larger patient load on other hospitals, especially public hospitals. Within the system, burnout is a very real thing, and nurses are just deciding to leave the profession. During this pandemic, when beds were needed most to treat acute COVID-19 patients, private providers suffered a liquidity crisis. This was the effect of lockdowns, government regulations, and patient deferrals. And this led to private sector respond, furloughing staff, refusals of treatment, hospital closures, and an attempt to gouge patient in order to make profits. Low and middle income countries were particularly affected as they were dependent on private providers as a consequence of neglect of national health systems or imposed conditionalities under neoliberal governance. important for us to understand that in order for us to fight pandemics like COVID-19, we need not only to access for universal quality care, we also need to have access to public energy. There are so many people in this world who are still living without either of these things. COVID-19 has made us acutely aware of the vulnerabilities and inequalities of health systems across the world. Long before the pandemic, the lack of reliable power in healthcare facilities in places like sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia was undermining the quality of healthcare for millions of people. This should not be taking place in the 21st century. Healthcare is a basic human right, and so is power and energy. More than just a contributor to global warming, our pollution and healthcare are also has a reputation of being a hard industry for the health of its nurses. We are prone to needle stick injuries, back injuries, laser allergies, stress, and most of all, violence in the workplace. Single-payer healthcare in the United States would help with all this by implementing better staffing ratios, which would lead to less burnout and put more focus on keeping patients healthy than dealing with acute sickness. Just like privatized healthcare can be crippling, so can purchasing power and energy. Just like a lack of access of healthcare, a lack of access to power or energy can be detrimental to one's health and life. These things truly go hand in hand. We need power and energy for adequate healthcare. We should not be going into debt because of these seeking to profit off our poor and health. We should not be forced into poor health because we lack access to power and energy, physically or financially. We must end the fossil fuel economy to save our health. We want to breathe, and we want our communities and patients to be able to breathe too. Clean air is a right that no one should have to forfeit. More than half of the health sector's footprints in the United States is attributable to energy use, primarily consumption of electricity, gas, steam, and air conditioning supply combined with the health sector's operational emissions. Health organizations, public and private, should invest in and advocate for decarbonization of local and national energy systems and the implementation of clean, renewable energy at the local, state, and national levels. In addition, we need to advocate for public ownership of energy so that we can finally put an end to an economy built on fossil fuels. Lastly, it is important to partner with local decision makers, local health and government officials. We have to build strong community allies. Being the most respected profession and dealing daily with confronting the link between health and climate change, nurses have an obligation to be at the table of policy decisions. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you, Nella, very much. Just in the spirit of time, I'm going to move quickly on to our next speaker. We have online joining us Jackson Cullinan from Unite Scotland, who I think will now appear on the screen. Do I need to tell Jackson that he's muted?
Can you hear me now? You can. Good stuff. Well, those who are here in person are in Scotland, and you will have noticed it is a very windy and wet place. And largely because of that, we were promised that Scotland would become you know, the principal area of the world for renewables. We were told that we would become the renewable equivalent of Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis oil, and there would be a job bonanza. The reality is that today we are losing jobs in renewables, and at no point have we came close to the figures of the jobs that we were promised. And there's a number of examples that I could cite to you of you know, closures and problems that have been faced. But I just want to take just a couple of minutes just to talk about the experience of BIFAB. BIFAB, which its proper title being Burnt Island Fabrications, was a company whose history goes back actually to 1918 and has diversified in a number of occasions throughout its history, from shipbuilding into work on oil platforms, and then into the renewable sector, and principally involved in the fabrication work around wind towers, fitting the jackets to wind towers, etc. And in 2017, it was announced that the 3 BIFAB sites in Scotland, namely Burnt Island and Methil in Fife and Arnish on the Isle of Lewis, would be closing. And they would be closing at a point where the workers had completed at that point about 70% of the work that they were contracted on to do work for the wind power farm, the Beatrice wind power farm in the North Sea. The workers' response, I have to say, was tremendous. They immediately occupied the sites. They continued to perform what in effect was a work-in, and those workers and their families and their local communities marched in Edinburgh to the doors of the Scottish Parliament. The end product of that at that point was that the Scottish Government did intervene and provided some cash support in the form of loans and the taking out of a minority stake in the company. And all of that meant that the Beatrice project could be completed. However, BIFAB, then purchased by a Canadian company known as DF Barnes, then struggled to get contracts for future renewables work, or indeed if they did get contracts, then those contracts were minimal in terms of the scale of the work that they were awarded. And perhaps the most shocking example of this was in relation to what was known as the Seagreen project, where the main contract winners for the fabrication work were located in China, in Indonesia, in the United Arab Emirates. And we had the scandal, quite frankly, of work being transported on diesel burning barges thousands of miles to be completed and returned to Scotland to go into the Seagreen project, which is only a stone's throw, a handful of miles away from the BIFAB plants in Fife. The next big project, the NNG project, BIFAB were only successful in being awarded work on 8 of the jackets when there was over 100 jackets for that project. And at that point, the Scottish Government pulled out and removed their financial guarantees. The BIFAB sites, 2 of them, not the 3 of them, but 2 of them, have been purchased by an offshoot of Harland and Wolff, and they are now back in operation with the promise of hundreds of jobs, although we wait to see how many jobs will be created and indeed what the nature of those jobs will be, because even in 2017, a very large proportion of the jobs in BIFAB were agency labour and secure forms of employment. So the BIFAB example demonstrates a couple of major points for us. The first is that we cannot continue to rely on procurement and contracting systems like we have in the UK and in Scotland, which is biased in favour of price and profit and takes no real cognizance of social need, of the need for a supply chain within the renewable sector, and the need to support the communities upon which this work relies. So we're clear that in terms of moving forward, we need to have more investment, we need to have more planning, we need to have things that are regulated. And all of that is in stark contrast to the views of some of those at the COP26 last week and this week, who believe in an ideological sense that the free market can solve the current crisis. It is more than ironic that we can have Tory members of Parliament chairing a conference and talking about just transition. Now, in one sense, that's a testimony to the fact and the good campaigning work that has been done that makes it difficult for them to dismiss the arguments for just transition. But what it also does is demonstrate that we need to shift from a supposedly class neutral, politically neutral perspective of what just transition means to one that is different from that. And in terms of what would be different from that, then we do need to have public ownership in order to control the transition. Because the old saying is, and it's the old truism is, that you cannot control what you do not own. And therefore, public ownership and common ownership has to be put very firmly on the agenda, not just in terms of energy supply. And sadly, the Scottish Government have stepped back from their previous pledge to have a publicly owned energy company. But it also means having public ownership and common ownership in terms of the supply chain, which is essential for the development of renewables. The other thing that it demonstrates is...
Sorry to interrupt. I'm told that we need to be strict on time because of the interpreter. So if I could just ask you to wrap up in a minute.
Well, I'll finish on this point, but I do think it's an important point, and that is that BIFAB, now under the guise of Intrastrata, Harland and Wolff, would not be there today if those workers had not occupied that site or those sites and taken those actions. And that demonstrates that a just transition for us has to be a worker-led transition. So I will finish on the point that the General Secretary of the STUC, Ros Foya, summed it up for me a couple of weeks ago at a meeting that we were at, when she said that the trade union movement needs to become more green, but the green movement needs to become more red. And I think that is a very succinct summary of what needs to happen here. So sorry for taking up so much time, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Excellent. A great strong note to finish on that received a rousing round of applause here in the room, Jackson, in case you can't hear that. I want to move on again quickly to Karine Granger, who is the energy advisor for the French mining and energy workers, which is part of CGT, the National Federation in France. Karine, if you're there. And just to note, I wasn't sure how to signal people online, but I will signal using the mic when you have a minute left, and I'm going to have to be a bit strict going forward. Apologies. Over to you, Karine.
Merci, John.
Thank you, John. I will try to make sure my discourse fits in the allotted time. First of all, thank you for this essential moment to exchange for the construction of a collective front against neoliberal policies, which are surfing on the deconstruction of energy systems and energy markets in order to generate profits against the general interest and by going through the shameful greenwashing of finance. I would like to remind you today that the last domain in which we didn't want to see pension funds and other private actors come in and to push profit and financial performance is now fallen. I would like to speak of the small modular reactors of the nuclear sector, which thanks to a reduction of the coupled installed power and the modularity, will see private capitals take a hold of its production means. And this should represent less money, and therefore they will come and grab these production tools, which have a number of security elements at stakes, which will be hard to compensate with, or to be hard to fight against profit measures. When we see how neoliberal policies have destabilized the national energy policies in France to turn it into a short-term business without reaching the common objectives. Markets have emerged very just a little time before the climate issue became essential and a priority, and because of the necessity to use high carbon fuels and not low carbon fuels. They've been justified by the necessity to have a first necessity good, and of which the economy is quite particular. At all moments, there ought to be a balance between production and consumption. Without mass storing solutions, which we cannot have, given that it's a merchandise very different than others, we see that electricity, low carbon electricity, can be is closer to water than oil in terms of its use. In order to have a successful energy transition, we must call on citizens of all countries to turn to a low carbon energy with a managed cost without any fail in the continuity of service. In France, we had a continuity of service which was below an hour a few years ago, and now we're augmenting these criteria of interruptions because we are unable to have continuous production. And neoliberal policies prefer lack of energy to lower gain, and this is having an impact on the cost for households and the threat of not being able to use low carbon emissions is still there. Before we say we need to consume less, we must start consuming more. This is of great interest to the states and their power intervention on the sector. They have, for the most part, left to pull out their checkbook, but when they have to do so in favor of the most marginalized who are increasing, they do not do it. They do it only if there is pressure from private providers who do not want to carry the risks. And we remain in a neoliberal logic. In France, the disastrous balance of these disastrous economies, which will not allow us to reach the necessary objective to reduce green gas emissions, are refused despite the fact that we asked it before our historical energy operator was dismantled. This balance would have made us right, both in terms of the cost of electricity and in terms of the quality of service for users. Since 2019, we've built a widespread struggle against government projects which aim to destroy what still existed in terms of public service for electricity and gas in France. These projects aim to dismantle corporations which represent a threat, of which the petrol industry. And the proof of that is that EDF, which is a mainly public operator, is forced to cease at a very low cost a quarter of its production to new competitors. We therefore immediately built a struggle for a project. We've built our project around 4 axes to exit the market for the public sector, a unique, fair based on needs and a fiscality, energy fiscality that ought to be more transparent and not be reflected, not weigh on the users' energies, and a greater solidarity and a fundamental right to access energy for all. We owe this victory to retired workers in the sector who had something in common, the historical DNA in terms of the struggle against neoliberal policies. Today it is a struggle for the past 75 years. Public service is an energy for the future, and we want to hold on to this slogan. We are satisfied that our struggle is heard beyond borders and that it can be led with the support of TRUED and PSI, which moves forward with our progressive agenda for energy. It is also a great satisfaction to see that this struggle is improving and that it's being heard louder and louder. Our interest must unite in order to have a chance to oppose private actors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karine, and thank you for being diligent about sticking to time. Apologies for the interruption, of course. I want to mention also that Karine has been very actively involved in a process that TUED has been participating in over most of this past year, developing a very comprehensive, lengthy, detailed analytical report looking at the failures of neoliberal energy policy in some detail and trying to begin to sketch in a bit of detail as well the alternative kinds of approaches that we need to be embracing. I'll come back and mention that at the end if there's time. But most of the people you're hearing from today have been involved in that process in one way or another. Karine has been particularly closely involved and want to acknowledge that and the role of FNME in making her available for a considerable amount of time. Next, we will hear from a comrade from Argentina, Rodolfo Kempf, who is with the Argentine Workers' Central Union Autonomous, CTA. And there's a technical wrinkle here because of the limitations with Zoom and remote translators. Rodolfo will be speaking with consecutive translation for the people in the room here and I think online as well. But I have a question then if that affects the amount of time that I'm making available for him, because I think there's going to be more time for... Yeah, okay, all right. So we're giving Rodolfo and translator 12 minutes if needed. Yeah, okay, over to you, Rodolfo.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Disculpen.
Thank you very much.
Le voy a hablar en...
I am...
Y voy a compartir unas reflexiones de nuestro territorio. Soy trabajador del área energía, organizado en la Central de los Trabajadores Argentinos Autónomos.
Thank you very much for the invitation today. I am Rodolfo Kempf from the Central of Trabajadores Argentinos, the Autonomous Workers of Argentina, and it is a pleasure to be here today to speak to you.
Desde la Central de Trabajadores Argentinos Autónoma, partimos del principio que la energía debe ser considerada un bien social y su libre disponibilidad un derecho humano por el cual luchar.
From the Central, we start from the principle that energy should be considered a social good and its free availability is a human right to fight for.
A partir de la pandemia de COVID, quedó en evidencia la crisis profunda que atraviesa el mundo. Las y los trabajadores hemos jugado un rol central contra la pandemia. Primero, en la lucha contra la derecha y luego en la disposición de todos nuestros recursos y capacidades para frenar y disminuir los estragos del virus COVID sobre la población de nuestro país.
Since the COVID-19 pandemic began, The deep crisis that the world is going through has become evident. We, workers, have played a central role against pandemics, first in the fight against the right, and then in the provision of all our resources and capabilities to stop and reduce the ravages of the COVID virus on the population of our country.
Esto demostró la importancia de un contingente enorme de trabajadores y trabajadoras muy calificados para la generación de energía, pero además conscientes de que la posibilidad de desplegar nuestra tarea en un país como el nuestro está atada a un modelo con profunda distribución de la riqueza para un desarrollo soberano, popular y feminista.
This demonstrated the importance of a huge contingent of highly skilled workers for power generation, but also aware that the possibility of deploying our task in a country like ours is tied to a model with a deep distribution of wealth for a sovereign, popular, and feminist development.
La singularidad histórica que implica la pandemia por COVID profundizó la pandemia de gobiernos de derecha, como fue el de Macri, y son los de Piñera, Bolsonaro, Duque, Lasso y Boris Johnson, entre otros. Por eso, desde la Central de Trabajadores Argentinos, decimos que debemos superar las dos pandemias.
The historical singularity that implies the pandemic by COVID-19 deepened the pandemic of right-wing governments, such as those of Macri and Piñera, Bolsonaro, Duque, Lasso, Boris Johnson, and others. That is why, from the CTAA, we say that we must overcome the two pandemics.
Para los trabajadores y trabajadoras, la pandemia fue un desafío para la organización en condiciones nuevas de virtualidad, de conexión digital y por la oportunidad que encontró el neoliberalismo para avanzar sobre nuestros derechos colectivos.
For workers, the pandemic was a challenge for the organization in new conditions of virtuality, digital connection, and the opportunity that neoliberalism found to advance on our collective rights.
Es por eso que para la CTA fue muy importante participar y poner en común en el Foro Global de TUED el contenido del programa sindical para un futuro energético público con baja emisión de carbono.
That is why it was very important for the CTAA to participate and share in the TUED global forums and in the content development of the trade union program for a public energy future with low energy carbons.
La temperatura y los eventos climáticos extremos se incrementaron considerablemente y si bien de esta COP no se esperan los cambios necesarios, lo que sí podemos asegurar es que la naturaleza es un campo de batalla.
What we know is that nature is a battlefield. The temperature and extreme weather events have increased considerably, and although the necessary changes are not expected from this COP26, again, we know that nature is a battlefield.
Es decir, un campo donde se conjugan al menos tres grandes corrientes por donde el debate político ambiental se desarrolla en este tiempo histórico. El ecocapitalismo, las perspectivas alternativas que plantean atajos y las emancipatorias en busca de una propuesta superadora al capitalismo.
That is to say, a field where at least three great currents are conjugated, where the environmental political debate is developing in this historical time. Eco-capitalism, the alternative perspectives which propose shortcuts, and the emancipatory ones in search of a proposal to overcome capitalism.
Estas no son corrientes inertes ni inmóviles, Por el contrario, se entrecruzan en el seno mismo de las luchas concretas. Sin embargo, en el concierto de debates, tanto el rol del imperialismo como la ruptura revolucionaria con el orden capitalista se plantean muy de soslayo, y las experiencias socialistas actuales, todas ellas distintas, incluso en su asedio y con profundidades diferentes, en términos de propiedad pública, participación popular y planificación económica, no se presenta como ejemplos ni como posibilidades.
These are not inert or immobile currents. On the contrary, they are intertwined in the very heart of concrete struggles. However, in the concert of debates, both the role of imperialism and the revolutionary rupture with the capitalist order are very much in the background. And the current socialist experiences, all of them, of course, different and with different depths in terms of public property and popular participation and economic planning, are not presented as examples or even possibilities.
Digo esto principalmente por Cuba, por Venezuela o Bolivia.
I say this with Cuba, Venezuela, and Bolivia in mind.
Es decir, existen perspectivas que con la intención de superar la dramática crisis ambiental proponen salidas que dejan por fuera a las clases y sectores populares. ¿Qué implica esto? Sectores quedan afuera de acceso a las TICs y a la conectividad global, a viviendas con eficiencia energética, a medicamentos y a vacunas, e incluso a la propia reproducción de la vida.
In other words, there are perspectives that, with the intention of overcoming the dramatic environmental crisis, propose solutions that leave out the popular classes and sectors. What does this imply? Sectors are left out of the access to technologies and global connectivity, energy-efficient housing, medicines and vaccines, and even the reproduction of life.
Desde la CTA impulsamos herramientas que se adecúen para dar lucha concreta por soberanía y democracia energética, que articule la necesidad de una dirección democrática y el control popular de la energía.
From the CTA, we promote tools that are suitable for a concrete struggle for energy sovereignty and democracy that articulate the need for democratic leadership and popular control of energy.
Esto abre la posibilidad de construir nuevas herramientas globales, por ejemplo, la de edificar un TUED Sur, que sobre la base del programa sindical para un futuro energético público con bajas emisiones de carbono, nos permita abordar los pliegues y contradicciones concretas de nuestra región que tenga en cuenta estos 5 indicadores.
This opens the possibility of building new global tools, for example, to build a TUED South, that on the basis of the trade union program for a public energy future with low carbon emissions, allows us to address the folds and concrete contradictions of our region, which takes into account these 5 following indicators.
Cumplir con el derecho a la energía, la necesidad de resolver la situación de desigualdad en nuestro continente, permitiendo el acceso a la energía eléctrica a los más de 30 millones de personas que hoy no lo tienen y donde aún 8 millones de personas cocinan con leña o rezagos.
The first, fulfilling the right to energy, the need to resolve the situation of inequality in our continent, allowing access to electricity to more than 30 million people who today do not have it, and where even 8 million people cook with firewood or lags.
Revertir las leyes y directivas neoliberales, estableciendo un enfoque público y planificado de la transición energética, una planificación energética frente al descalabro privatista neoliberal, donde el 1% de la población concentra más de la mitad de la tierra y casi la mitad del petróleo producido se exporta.
Number 2, reversing neoliberal laws and directives, establishing a public and planned approach to the energy transition. This would include understanding that energy planning in the face of neoliberal privatization, where 1% of the population owns more than half of the land and almost half of the oil produced is exported.
En tercer lugar, empresas públicas de nuevo tipo en el camino de una nueva gobernanza, incorporando a las comunidades originarias con participación plena en las decisiones, en el control y en la regulación. Hemos presentado la semana pasada en el sindicato STUC una propuesta desde nuestro central de una empresa binacional de industrialización del litio con estas características en conjunto con Bolivia.
Public companies of a new form on the road to a new vision of public governance. This would include incorporating indigenous communities with full participation in decisions, control, and regulation. And this is something that I talked about in a previous event that STUC helped to host with regards to a binational lithium company.
En cuarto lugar, las garantías colectivas para los y las trabajadores, donde se ponga sobre la mesa el carácter productor de la clase trabajadora en lugar de focalizar en el emprendedorismo.
Fourth, collective guarantees for workers, where the productive character of the working class is put on the table instead of focusing on entrepreneurship.
Y en quinto lugar, que aborde los términos de intercambio soberano entre naciones y empresas desde el valor de uso frente al valor de cambio.
And lastly, fifth, to address the terms of sovereign exchange between nations and companies from use value versus exchange value.
Los debates ambientales que nacen en la década del 60 del siglo XX, en ese marco, el Che Guevara daba uno de sus memorables discursos en el segundo seminario económico de solidaridad afroasiática realizado en Argel en febrero de 1965. No me voy a extender por el tiempo, pero hago un análisis después tengo del propio discurso que nos ayuda a entender esta situación.
The environmental debates that were born in the 60s of the 20th century, and in that framework and analyzing those environmental debates, we see Che Guevara gave one of his most memorable speeches at the Second Economic Seminar of Afro-Asian Solidarity held in Algiers in February of 1965. And I had planned a bit of an analysis of that speech, but due to time constraints, I'll just highlight a few points.
En ese discurso del Che Guevara postula una mirada integral de la lucha de clases, conformando y configurando el conjunto de los aspectos de la sociedad. Un caso concreto donde esta mirada volvió a emerger y converge en los 4 indicadores mencionados, los 5 indicadores mencionados, es el del litio, clave para las tecnologías de almacenamiento energético, amortiguando el rasgo intermitente de las energías renovables y también para la movilidad eléctrica.
Che postulates a proposal for the establishment of a link between socialist and underdeveloped countries where the former have a key role in determining that the terms of commercial and financial exchange are not governed by the law of value or by the rules of the capitalist game. And this is parallel with the 5 points that I just described and that we are now applying to the binational lithium company.
A diferencia de Chile y Argentina, el gobierno de Evo Morales estatizó los yacimientos del litio, creó una empresa estatal para conducir el proceso de explotación, investigación y estableció la producción en plantas piloto.
On a course that contrasts and runs contrary to the neoliberal model, Evo Morales and others have proposed public energy companies that are run with principles of the social public mandate and that do not use the economic model of profit maximization, but rather public good maximization.
Para el escalamiento industrial inició acuerdos con Alemania y China que no tuvieran como eje único indiscutible el valor de cambio. De esa manera se permite resolver necesidades populares sin intercambio mercantil a partir de dispositivos en los cuales el litio cumple un rol clave. Para cerrar, y también en homenaje al día de ayer de la Revolución Bolchevique, lo voy a hacer más sintético, simplemente para cerrar, desde la CTA queremos recordar el grito de rebelión o extinción, y es cuando el Che vuelve a decir presente, porque si el presente es de lucha, el futuro es nuestro. Y para cerrar ahora sí, desde la CTA queremos saludar esta oportunidad que brinda TUED, STUC y el Centro de Transición Justa, parafraseando a un gran poeta argentino: para todos el pan, para todos la belleza.
And again, I think it's very valuable to do an analysis of this binational lithium model and what we have set up there. For example, when we look at the scale, we've seen exchanges that are mutually beneficial with Germany, with China, that prioritize a use value and not an exchange value. And now to close and returning to Che's path, which implies recovering the concrete synthesis of the forms in which the class struggle unfolds in our America in the face of the contradictions that today place the planet and the enormous majority of humanity on the edge of the abyss. To paraphrase what Rebellion Extinction has said, and as Che continues to say, the present is a struggle, the future is ours. Thank you on behalf of CTA, to TUED for this opportunity, to STUC, and all who have made this possible. And I'll close with paraphrasing some lines from a great poet who says, "For all the bread, for all the beauty." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodolfo, and thank you everyone for your patience. And it's so painful to try to cut off an intervention like that when there's so much good stuff to be heard. But I have been informed that we're very, very tight on time. We had two more speakers. I don't know whether we're going to have actually get to the final speaker from Trinidad and Tobago. Ozzy, I don't know if you can hear me. We'll do what we can to squeeze you in. But first, we're going to hear from Silvia Luna Ramos, who is the Secretary General of the Mexican Technical and Professional Workers Union of Pemex. And Silvia will be speaking online with simultaneous translation, I believe.
Buenos días. Gracias por la invitación. Aún desde antes que los primeros homínidos lograran la domesticación del fuego, entendieron la importancia de la energía. Por eso lucharon por dominarlo, porque lo necesitaban no solo para calentarse, sino para cocer sus alimentos, iluminarse durante la noche y protegerse de los depredadores.
Competitors. Energy has always been present in the development of mankind. Since 2000 years before our era, the Chinese burned coal to cook their food. And in the Persian Empire, we saw the mentions of the use of oil for medicinal purposes. In Persia, we saw the first oil lamps, and also Persians in the 5th era built the first mills that used wind energy. It was the energy of the wind together with the strength of the rowers that allowed the Phoenicians to dominate the Mediterranean. And this is what allowed us to do a scientific breakthrough. Therefore, we must be clear that energy is not an economic sector, but a structural dimension of the economy with an impact on all social life. It is a strategic sector. It is not a common commodity. So it is a matter of sovereignty and national security. Energy is a human right and cannot be subjected to the laws of the market because the market's principle is profit, and energy cannot be a commodity. It is strategic, and whatever its source of origin, whether wind, solar, nuclear, geothermal, hydroelectric, or thermal, must be under the control of the state. Energy cannot be subject to the law of supply and demand as happened in Texas in February of this year, when due to several winter storms, temperatures were recorded to under 19 degrees Celsius, which led to increased energy consumption. And since solar generators did not work because there was no sun and wind turbines were paralyzed due to the ice, electricity generation decreased. The lower the power production, the higher the cost of electricity. This caused the price of electricity to reach a value of $9,000 per megawatt hour, when the previous week it had been around $30 per megawatt hour. We can't forget the high rates for electricity consumption that are occurring in Spain these days is one more reason to reject the electricity market. The most affected are us, the users, who have to pay high tariffs. Oil workers know that fossil fuels are the main generators of CO2 to the environment that is causing climate change. And it is us, workers, who are the most interested in advancing towards energy transition. But we must fight for this transition to be fair, democratic, and with respect for human labor rights, such as the right to work and fair wages. That is why we support the reform to the constitution of our country proposed by the president, which for the first time includes the concept of energy transition, and which would be a breakthrough in the projection to reduce CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. For the first time, as I said, energy transition would be introduced to lower CO2 emissions. And to advance in this transition, the administration of AMLO advances technological policies and includes lithium as a strategic material, which would allow us to move towards an energy transition with sovereignty, as no more concessions would be granted for this mineral and only the state could exploit it. As engineers, we know the strengths and weaknesses of our alternative energies to oil, and we are committed to a just transition. We dream, we believe, we are convinced that another better world is possible, that another more just society is possible. And it is the workers who generate the wealth, those of us who have built the past, who are the main builders of the future. The present is one of struggle to change the system, because it is impossible that a system whose main modus operandi is the irrational exploitation of natural resources can be sustainable indefinitely. The planet can't take any more. If we want to save humanity, we have to change a system that has its main triumph in the corpses of hundreds of migrants in the Mediterranean, thousands of dead from the famines across the world, millions of unemployed in the world. Yes, comrades, the present is a struggle, but the future is ours, not a step backwards. Until victory, we will always win. For an integrated and national oil industry at the service of the homeland, Silvia Ramos Luna, General Secretary of UNTIC. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Fantastic note to not end on. I am told there is a logistical option. They're needing to bring lunch and start setting up here, but we are going to be able to go ahead and hear Ozzy. We're going to need to vacate this front table, though, and I think they may need to move a camera. And then, Ozzy, I hope you're on and available. If you can hear me, if you could please be ready to go in 30 seconds or so.
I'm always ready.
Excellent. That's Ozzy, everyone. Now you know. Are we ready to go, Irene? Irene, ready to go? Yep. Ozzy, over to you. Take it away, comrade. Sorry, let me introduce you. This is Ozzy Warwick.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Education officer with the Oil Workers Union in Trinidad and Tobago. I beg your pardon.
Yes, thank you very much, Comrade John, and I would like to thank TUED for having me to share the Trinidad and Tobago struggle for a progressive, just transition. I would like to extend solidarity to Comrades Nella, Jackson, Rodolfo, and Sylvia in their struggles, and to all the comrades assembled in the Just Transition Hub in Govan and Linthouse Parish Church. Really, I wish I could be there with you all. Solidarity from the Oilfield Workers Trade Union in Trinidad and Tobago. I want to make my remarks within the framework of two things very quickly. One, reclaiming the term just transition and going further in calling for a progressive just transition. Secondly, the idea that there has to be a public ownership of energy. They are both interconnected. When we consider the Trinidad and Tobago experience, the government is attempting to hijack the term just transition. The Prime Minister mentioned it in his speech in COP26, but even as they do that, the reality on the ground is that some 30,000 workers have already lost their jobs. We have between 2015 and 2019, we have seen the closure of the National Oil Company. We have seen the closure of the steel sector. We have seen closures of several petrochemical plants, and they plan to privatize the port, privatize fuel distribution, privatize power generation and distribution. So when our Prime Minister talks about reskilling and retooling and capacity development, it's all a lie. It's not real. It's not grounded in reality. What in fact we are experiencing right now is structural adjustment program based on the government's neoliberal ideology. And thanks to the assistance of TUED, we have been able to launch a fight back. We've been able to launch a response, even as the government is attempting to package this structural adjustment program as a just transition, when in fact it's simply aimed at advancing further privatization, commodification, and liberalization of our country. Making matters worse is recent discussions with Shell and BP, who are already poised to take completely over our transition to renewable. So what this means is that what is coming is not green growth, but what I call green colonialism. Trinidad and Tobago, the unions, we intend to show that the transition can only be just when all stakeholders are seated at the table, building and creating the plans for not only a just transition, but a progressive just transition to ensure decent work and protection for the vulnerable in the society, for those most impacted, workers and communities. I want to, because I know time is very short, so I want to close here by saying to all our comrades, we must join together in global solidarity to fight going forward ever towards a progressive just transition and public ownership of energy, and never ever backwards to new forms of neocolonialism and neoliberalism under the guise of so-called green growth. And to echo the statement by Comrade Jackson, we must fight for red growth, not green growth. Long live the trade union movement, comrades, in our struggle and fight against climate change. Solidarity from Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you.
That's outstanding. Thank you, Ozzy, for bringing things home in the end. I don't know whether you could hear, but you also got a very rousing round of applause from a house as packed as they would let us pack it. And with that, I did promise to mention the trade union program for a public low-carbon energy future. If I can get back on the Zoom, I will post those links into the chat in the Zoom. Otherwise, you could speak to one of us from TUED. We can get you the information for that. There was an enormous amount of work that went into developing this. It's just several pages of very, very tight, precise bullets that are informed by a nearly 200-page, very detailed report that will be out early next year. We've got, I think, 17 unions that have already signed on to it, including Public Services International, the French Mining and Energy Union, FNME, where Karine is from, the Scottish Trades Union Congress, and many others. I won't try to name them for fear of forgetting someone important. So I will, as I say, try to post those in the Zoom chat, or one of my colleagues will if they can get to it. Thank you very much for your time and for your patience with the technical complications, and I believe we're headed for lunch shortly.